I am a behavioral health executive. I know it because of my socks. Now, it's been about a decade ago that I was interviewing with one of the largest companies in our industry for an executive role on the outskirts of Atlanta. And the question on the table, how could they be sure that I had converted? Now, like many of you, I started my career as a clinician. And when I started, I had everything I needed. Behind me was my LPC and my diploma on the wall. On my desk was my Zen garden with its tiny little rake. And every day, I went to work and I wore my black dress crew socks. How many of you are wearing crew socks today? And I didn't know what P&L was, but I was very excited about making a difference in mental health. But here I sat nervous. How was I going to persuade this interviewer that I had converted? That I had shed any of the excessive sentimentality of a clinician and had accepted the full mantle of executive responsibility. Now, as we talked, it became clear to me that this interviewer actually believed there was a way you could tell, that he could visibly see whether that transformation had taken place or not. I am not making this story up. His belief was that if your sock came over the calf, that you had completed that transformation. Now, I argued. I said, look, by that time I'd gotten an MBA, and more importantly, I was wearing a pinstripe suit and had on my power tie. But no, those would be betrayed. Those were external and superficial trappings that would be betrayed by a sock underneath. Now, at that point, I felt backed into a corner. I had to prove my authenticity. So I did what any of you would do. He didn't actually ask, but I'm not making this up either. I lifted that pant leg up, and what did he find? All the way to the top. Now look, you can only see these kinds of things in Vegas, so I was bona fide. That proved that I had made the conversion, right? Now that's superficial, a little odd, and we can't be absolutely sure that he didn't just want to see my calves. But I don't think so. I think he was looking at a question that's pretty crucial. You know, many of us in this audience are among the 25,000 plus behavioral health care executives who started our careers as clinicians, counselors, social workers, psychiatrists, nurses. But today, we work in the C-suites of community mental health. We lead hospitals or health centers. We administrate in health plans or state authorities. And our education, our professional orientation, began with Skinner, with Rogers, with Freud. This interviewer wanted to know, are those the only voices in our head? Now, last year, Pixar returned to greatness with a movie about an 11-year-old whose family moves to the big city. And boy, did her world change. Inside Out gives us an up-close and personal glimpse into the headquarters of her mind, her command center, what's going on inside, and we saw 5 emotions. I'm going to argue that we behavioral health executives need a model. We need a mental model to guide our activities, our decisions. And the old saying is models are a dime a dozen, but you have to have one. So let's try. The model I'm going to present is actually also 5, not emotions, but voices, frames, if you will. And I'm going to adapt from a model in reframing organizations. But more importantly, I'm going to ignite these frames with the real life experiences that I've had with some amazing mentors. I've been really, really fortunate to be able to work with some of the champions of our field. They have become my heroes. They have become the voices in my head. And I'm going to try to depict these as best I can today. I think this is the voice that interviewer was trying to get at with his sock test. We'll call him Net, and he's the finance guy. Now, when I first met Richard, I could tell the difference in a balance sheet and a cash flow statement. For the most part, I could sniff out financial BS, baloney and stuff. But I have to admit that the finance voice did not have an equal seat in my command center. Now, Richard was leading one of the largest health plan contracts in the country, and we were neck deep in the worst economic downturn of our lives. Richard is not a CPA, but he had a saying about driving results: gentle pressure, relentlessly applied. It was 2009 when I charged into the long conference room there in the Phoenix offices for a budget meeting. And I said, team, I've stayed up late and I've got the solution. Now, I know yesterday we talked about eliminating Marvin and Marvin's program. And I get that Marvin's productivity's been poor, the outcomes have been not great, but Marvin's nearing retirement, so I've got an alternative. Instead, if we tweak our travel policy, if we change our cell phone provider, if we do a lot of these other things over here, we can get the alternative savings. If we save our quarters, we can get enough not to have to eliminate Marvin's program. And Richard, this was the telltale sign that the finance voice was actively engaged. He said, David, I get these are hard decisions, but we are the stewards of these funds. And we're going to need to now do both of these ideas that you've come up with. And we'll get double the savings. Now, those kinds of decisions actually helped mitigate on the real lives of people receiving services a very difficult time. Frankly, those of us who've worked in not-for-profit community mental health where I'm from, we've been protected from the larger healthcare environment. Those walls are coming down. Our finance voice has to be actively and fully engaged if we're going to be successful. And SOC test or not, we've got to be listening here. So let's go to a second voice. Now for this one's a little less corporate, a little less formal. So, this is a little bit like going over to dinner at Mom's house. I'm going to put my tie in my shirt here. This one is the voice, we're going to call it people. And people uses the mental frame of thinking about the organization of a family. Now, I first met Linda when we were across the street in the MGM Grand in 2007. And it's really amazing, the success story of how she has grown an association of community mental health centers and their partners into a big tent of national influence and contribution. But what I remember most about the people voice of Linda is we were at a steering committee meeting at SAMHSA headquarters in Rockville on the first floor. And during a break, she came to me and said, David, I'd like you to consider pursuing a seat on our board of directors. But it was the way that she did that, inspiring me to join a group that was intent on putting a dent in the universe. The voice of people reminds us this generation of employees is not there just for a paycheck. They want meaning and purpose in what they're doing. The voice of people asks us to ask some questions. Do our employees have a best friend at work? Do they believe their work matters? Does a supervisor or someone at work care about them? Do they get to do what they do best every day? The voice of people encourages us to do an annual employee satisfaction survey to objectively measure engagement, autonomy, and voice. It encourages us to invest in our employees' skills and professional development, and it's always on the lookout for increasing diversity in our leadership and our workforce. I remember being in an all-employee meeting where a corporate executive chided us that he wasn't that interested in employees who were committed first to a professional orientation or something else. It was commitment to the company first. Well, the voice of people reminds us that our employees today, they want a glorious purpose, a big dream, and they will commit to a company that is supporting them in that endeavor. Third voice. Every business is a factory in a sense. Our factory provides programs and services. The content of those is clinical, it's medical, it's recovery. All of this talk about covering up superficial things like my socks, and I feel like I've almost covered up. I'm hiding from, how many of you are clinicians in the room? We who are clinicians, we're clinicians. We shouldn't hide from that. In fact, look at, can we raise the lights? Dr. Bart Andrews here is, he is not hiding. coincidentally, it's the same shirt that Bart is wearing this morning. It was designed by a New York Times featured suicide attempt survivor named Desiree Stage. And this mentor of mine, another mentor named Richard, we see a sea change happening in mental health today around people with lived experience. Richard was driving that process a decade ago with a suicide attempt survivor, what we call Consumer Support Subcommittee. Richard is SAMHSA branch chief for suicide prevention, and he has been leading national policy and standards that has really resulted in some titanic shifts in the tectonic plates of social change. But what I remember most about Richard's clinical soul, if you will, is a decade ago, it's not been that long, we were in a small training room in a Hilton Garden Inn outside of BWI Airport in Baltimore. And we were talking about suicide prevention in middle school. And he made this statement. Over the decades, individual clinicians have made heroic efforts to save lives. But systems of care have done very little. That statement became one of the key drivers in an international phenomenon to equip clinicians to do what they love and do it better, and to give them the confidence to engage those at risk, and together to create an environment where we aspire for something called zero suicide. Far from converting from or hiding or covering up our clinical soul, we ought to embrace it. So let's go to a fourth voice. And for this one, I actually need to be a little bit more formal. Now, we're not just talking about an external analysis of the organization. We're talking about the backbone of integrity. And for me, that's embodied by my friend and mentor, Sue, who is the leader of a think tank and consulting group, has been an executive in companies like formerly Value Options and TRICARE. Today, I think back on the things that Sue and I have done over the last few years to implement a compliance program. Now, the first thing we did was an organizational assessment using the Marguerite Casey Foundation not-for-profit tool, which gave us a benchmark of where we should be. We began developing with our board of directors a strategy and vision roadmap for the future, and began to create how we're going to get there. So we did some things. We hired a chief of compliance who reports directly to the board of directors, not to me. We also implemented an external and confidential ethics hotline that we market to our employees. And we increased education around compliance for all of our staff and our board of directors. But in the short term, this process was extremely nerve-wracking. I remember when we first took this program, the changes required the investment to our leadership. And there were four of us, Sue, myself, and two others who were also in this room, gathered around a small table in my small office, and we were perspiring and waiting for the thumbs up or thumbs down to come across. But Sue emboldened me to take the long-term view. At the end of the day, integrity, the voice of risk is about integrity, honest and straight dealings, and us looking at the long-term risk of the organization. Now, for this last voice, voice number 5, I've got to do something symbolic here to kind of put a picture to it. And I can't quite do this with today's politics or we'll get derailed entirely. So let's do an old school approach here to politics. This is the jungle, and his name is Vision. Stop laughing, Leon. One of the highlights of my career has been working with Mike, who supervised mental health in 3 different states over 30 years and with multiple governors, and he was exceedingly successful in some really extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Now, when we talk about politics, a lot of negatives come to mind, right? Your view's even more jaundiced if I use the word power. But politics is the realistic process of getting things done, of making decisions, of allocating resources when there are divergent interests and resources are scarce. What have I learned from Mike? Well, for example, if you're in a group that's designed to get an action done, research shows that 30% of the people in that group are involved in getting it done. The other 70% of us are doing something else. thinking something else. See me afterward if you want to know. Research also shows when a new proposal for a program comes across an executive's desk, there are 3 reasons why they'll do that or not. Now, these are the dynamics of politics, of the jungle. My favorite story of Mike's is when he was chairing the President's New Freedom Commission report on mental health. And to my surprise, George W. Bush, president at the time, actually spent about an hour with that team. This was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a university. The president, 43rd president, strode into that room, and then he made his way through the crowd, his eyes on Mike's, never looking at a name badge or anything, and came up, shook his hand, and said, "Michael, I really appreciate you taking this on." And Mike replied, "Thank you, Mr. President. I hope we'll do work that's worthy of your trust." And he replied, I have no concerns about that at all. The voice of vision reminds us we're constantly thinking that our powers of reason, we're able to get things done that way. The voice of vision says, remember relationships. And frankly, there's a little bit of horse trading that's always involved in successful coalition building. Think about what the president gave that day. He took the time to remember faces and names. And he spent about an hour of his time. Now, if we have a straightforward agenda and roadmap, that helps navigate this jungle. It's even better if you have a big, hairy, audacious dream. But there's another component of the jungle, call it symbolism. Vision will give you the metaphors, the ceremonies, the rituals to cut through rich cultures and to make changes. That's the power of symbolism. Anybody remember the actual name of the President's New Freedom Commission report? It was very symbolic. It was called Achieving the Promise. We're making decisions all the time. We're making them for tactical, financial, symbolic, human resources. Everything we do is interpreted by others from a symbolic frame. And so we need to be mindful of that. So we have 5 frames. And if you go to the NatCon library downstairs or your local Barnes & Noble, you will find a host of books saying that any one of these different frames is the solution to leadership. The First Break All the Rules downstairs I saw on the table gives you some of the questions from that people category I talked about. I think they're all right. My experience with my mentors suggests all of them were strong in all 5 of these, even though I've highlighted a particular area for each. The book Reframing Organizations takes that approach. In fact, there's a quote from that book: "Explosive technology and social change is producing a world that is increasingly interconnected, frantic, and complicated." If we're going to be successful, we need all 5 frames. Frankly, we can't leave even one in the closet, not even for a moment. And this is not about juggling. We're not talking about focusing on one today and one tomorrow and one the next. They constantly all must be integrated in an argument, in a symphony, however they got to come together. Now, in Inside Out, Perky Joy was trying to find the happiness in every moment and keep sadness and those other emotions at bay. In the end, what she learned was they were all crucial to success. Now, each of us in this room is probably really strong in one of these, or more. We may also all have an Achilles heel, or an area, one or more, where we're weak. If we're going to be successful, we've got to become competent in all 5. Doesn't mean we won't still make mistakes, but we've got to integrate those together to be truly successful. Now, like 11-year-old Riley, we're not in small-town Minnesota any longer. And this world, it just keeps a-changing. But we are behavioral health care executives, and we are up to the charge. And I should know because I've got the socks.